Today I'm going to demonstrate what the idea behind a flipped classroom is, and this is going to be kind of a little homework assignment for you guys as we get going. Basically, I want you to take a look at this concept here. What is the flipped classroom? And you know, really the gist of it is you've got the traditional classroom, and where you have the teacher lectures, homework due tomorrow, blah blah blah, and then in the flipped classroom, the teacher's kind of the guide on the side, which is what it says here. So you've got your activity, and then from there you watch your lecture online at night. Okay, and I know there's some things obviously that go along with this. Would kids have enough time to to get this done? And what about activities? Do they have internet? So either way, just it's an idea, and I'm going to demonstrate how this works right now. So basically what I did is I created a Prezi, which I showed you guys before. And I'm just going to kind of go through and talk about grading, which will lead us into our staff meeting here. Grading. So there's going to be two articles I'm going to talk about: the case against grading, Alfie Kohn, grades that show, and then the next article is grades that show what students know by Robert Marzano and Temi Haffelbauer. And so basically what happens is they talk about in this first article the effects of grading. And grades tend to diminish a student's interest in whatever they're learning is a concept that this person has written about. And so, some of the things, if you think about that it could be true. If you look at the next slide here, the impact of grades on intrinsic motivation has found a negative effect. Possibility. Grades create a preference for the easiest possible task. And this is something, basically people, kind of the response to that would be most students respond by avoiding taking unnecessary intellectual risks. And I'll give you an example, not to pick on you, Mrs. Frashag, but one of the things when I was subbing, we were selecting books for her class, and of course, what does a kid do? They're going to pick the short book or the larger book. And I think that kind of goes along with this whole idea of, avoid taking those unnecessary risks that might come along with, I got to read a longer book, and those types of things. And really what this teaches based on this article is that success matters more than learning. And and oftentimes we see that when we deal with kids. What do I need to do to get an A? What's the least minimum thing I got to do? Grades tend to reduce the quality of a student's thinking, would be another concept. And basically, let's just learn the facts. Let's just learn to do this. How do I do it? And are they really getting that deeper thinking concept? Now, if we move on, one of the other concepts that goes on here that Kohn talks about is why grading is inherently problematic. And see here, grades are not a necessary part of schools. They don't prepare students for real world issues. And they look at it like this: more students are led to focus on how well they're doing, the less engaged they tend to be with what they are doing. So if you think about that, are they less engaged with the actual activity, or are they just trying to get it done? They're just trying to get that worksheet done. And it goes on to talk about more about motivation. If nourishing students' desire to learn is a primary goal for us, then grading is problematic by its very nature. If you think about it, we've talked about motivation before. Intrinsic, that's your own desire to learn. Do our students have that? Or is it all about extrinsic, where they're just trying to get high marks? Is it motivation to learn, or is it, again, motivation to get the A? Leads us into our next article that was written by Marzano and I forget the other person, Temi Haffelbauer. And really, this is the whole concept that goes right along with PLCs and this whole idea of breaking down your standards and developing more, your common assessments around these power standards. So basically what I want to look at here is Traditional practices provide little useful information about a specific student. Student might have received a B, not because he had a solid grasp on the content, but because he was well behaved, participated in all discussions, and turned in all assignments on time. And then we mentioned this before about the concept of, that student that has an A and then all of a sudden they're not proficient on the state test. It's not a true representation of what that student knows, because we pull in behavior, we pull in, did they get these assignments in on time? Did they get any zeros? We all know that we have students that get zeros, and they're probably one of the highest achieving kids on the state test. So that right there, there's a disconnect, and I think that's a big time problem for our school. Another student receives a D for late assignments and has been disruptive, so the teacher penalizes them. This whole idea of, oh, you're making this noise in school, or you're doing this in my classroom, you're going to get a 0 for the day. What does that do? That's that whole concept of, we need to think about classroom management issues rather than, penalizing kids just because they act, but behaviorally they're acting bad. So that's that whole concept of giving them lower grades for that. One of the first recommendations that Marzano talks about is get rid of the overall grade. And how can you do that? If you can't do that, remove the overall grade. Provide scores on the measurement topics in addition to the grade. And I'm going to kind of back out of here for a minute and show you really what this person is talking about. Zoom in here. And so if you take a look here, this would be like what a standards-based report card would look like. You've got a first quarter report for a middle school math student. Measurement topics, you've got 0.5, 1.0, all the way to a 4.0 scale. So you would break it down as you go through and developing your essential learnings and your power standards that, okay, we've got a common assessment on number systems. Based on how we interpret these, we found that this student was 1.0 on a 4.0 scale when he first started. And that's what the dark blue represents their first formative test. And so the light blue represents once they take that overall summative test on how far they've grown. And so you can see how they set this up, and it's kind of a nice deal. Makes sense. So you can go through and say, okay, well, my student basically, it's helping us decide where they are at as far as learning. It's no longer pulling in all the ideas of giving a 0 for late assignments, giving a 0 for behavior in their class. It's helping you out in that aspect. So we get more of a true grade per se for this individual student, and we can see where they have issues at. Obviously, we see the student does really well on ration and proportion, percent, patterns, and we've seen they've really improved on patterns. So that's a nice thing to see. And again, this takes a ton of work, but it just makes total sense at this point to be able to to do this as we go along in our PLC process. And this next chart is kind of how they lined it up, 3.5, 4.0, and how we could relate it to our current scale, basing it on proficiency. Back up out of here. So if we take a look and go back to my grading, okay, a couple more things here. Expand the assessment options available to students, and what they mean by that is, kind of probing the students and saying, well, can you tell me, where you are, and more of a discussion on assessment, some narrative stuff. Student-generated assessments could be an option with standard-based grading. Allow students to continually update their scores on previous measurement topics. So we're not saying, oh, you got the 0, you can't redo your tests, and that kind of goes into that article we read the other day. The whole idea of giving zeros for things and just saying, well, you can't retake it. Are we really shooting for learning there? I don't think that represents kind of what we need to stand for. So basically, conclusion: no single best way. What direction do we head from here? And I think those are things that we as a staff, we know that there's a problem with our grading, and we know that we need to do something about it. What direction that is, I don't know. But I do believe as we go through the PLC process that we figure out what direction we want to head to better help all our students learn. And that is the conclusion of the flipped staff meeting. So hopefully this kind of gives you an idea of what you can do, you know, as you lecture, or if you want to provide some lecturing, and you have them do it at home, and then they come in and you've got an activity. I think this could work in a lot of different classrooms, and it might be something you try to do every now and then. It's not very difficult, and I can kind of show you how to do it, but here's an example. Hopefully we can get something from this.